Vanessa.
Hello.
Oh, hey, Vanessa. Hey,
Hi,
Vanessa.
Dom.
Yeah, I'm glad you make yourself laugh.
Yeah, I mean, how else do you get through life?
Yes, I'm actually doom scrolling as there
Uh,
was a terror attack in Tel Aviv, and a few friends of
uh,
mine are now basically in
oh
lockdown.
dear. But they're okay.
Yeah, I hope so. Moments like these have the power of kind of grounding some of the things that we talk about in the abstract on the pod. Like last episode, we were talking about the power of violence as a political tool.
Yeah.
And like I said then, I'm very interested in thinking about it more seriously and deeply. But this is also a reminder of how fragile, how brittle social order and peace really are,
Yeah.
and how easily and quickly things can collapse. Because when you see this happen in places like Israel, where there is a history of political contention and violence and blood feuds, an attack like that is never isolated and will always lead to worse things, whether it is over response by government, which would lead to further deaths, or the erosion of trust when you have different populations living together. These things do not end well. These things do not improve on the ability to live in a pluralistic society. So, I'm very firmly skeptical of the power of violence to communicate constructive messages. But even as I'm saying this, I can foresee the objections that somebody like Kelly, who we talked to last week, would bring up. So, I'll save it when we have a more serious discussion of this topic. Now that I think about it, our next episode kind of wades into this area.
Right.
How to manage conflict on the brink of violence within diverse societies. So stay tuned for that. Today, we have Meghan Daum.
Is it Meghan Daum or Meghan Daum?
Let's brush this off as my Israeli accent. So
Okay. Yes, Meghan, who is the author of many books, including The Problem with Everything, which she released in 2019. And we actually start our conversation talking about that book because she kind of describes it as a pivot point in her career in which she doesn't find that she's done anything terribly different in the way she writes, but the way she's received has suddenly shifted, like the ground has shifted under her. And so it's pretty interesting talking with Meghan about writing in this cancel culture context. She fervently maintains that she was not canceled, but there were a lot of things that happened that were like cancel adjacent that were pretty interesting. And so we kind of dive into what the hell's going on in this day and age when you try to write about things that are a bit more dicey.
Her insistence that she wasn't canceled, which indeed she wasn't, because she was able to still retain a platform. She has a great podcast, which is
The Unspeakable podcast.
The Unspeakable podcast. So she never suffered that type of public ostracism that some people truly do. What she did experience is a softer kind of rebuke from erstwhile friends and the people she thought of as her community. So we talked about that, and we talk about the relationships that she's developed, the parasocial relationships that she developed from the podcast that she was following at the time that led her to believe that she was less lonely, and what loneliness more broadly means in a society that is finding its ideological and moral footing increasingly via YouTube channels and podcast avatars and political avatars as well.
Yeah. And that's a topic that I think we're just like scratching the surface of, and I think we'll want to explore that more, this idea of loneliness and the lack of meaning in people's lives. I mean, it's something we're talking about in different forms and fashions in a lot of our conversations, but it's something that keeps coming up. And so I think we'll be, if anyone listening has ideas for who you would want to hear on that topic, send us a line, because this is something we're thinking about a lot these days.
Right. The loneliness that political entrepreneurs and conflict entrepreneurs then rush in to fill up. Those are the type of vacuums that should not be ultimately filled by politics and political resentments.
Yeah. And one other thing we talk about with Meghan, which I think is interesting to note, is, we start talking about those types of journalists like Meghan, and I guess like in some ways us in our small little way, the kind of what I think Meghan calls this generation of kind of new heterodox content people that are trying to have more nuanced conversations and mostly living in the world of podcasts, although often on Substack as well. And the ways that this can like community with a small C and maybe in quotes community can kind of
Smaller than small c.
can kind of push conversations in more interesting directions, because it feels like maybe some of us have gotten stuck in the same gripes, the same complaints.
Of talking about the things that you can't talk about, right?
Yeah, and so that we briefly talk about that too, and I think that's also kind of a thread that we're going to try and develop a little bit more.
One asterisk, though, you did use the two forbidden words, heterodox and nuance, which I think we agreed should be completely banned from any English vocabulary, right?
Bleep them out. Just bleep them out in post. That's your job, Adam.
Yeah, it's heterodox, nuance, and Noam Chomsky. Those are the bleepable.
No, you still haven't created your Noam Chomsky jingle.
Right.
When are you going to do that? The people and myself are waiting.
So we are on certain things. We are on certain.substack.com where you can sign up, where you can give us schmeckles if you want to support our work so we can buy our coffee. And we are writing more and more content for these supporters. We are Uncertain Pod on the social media when we are on the social media, which is infrequent, but our DMs are always open. So if you want to write us, we will respond. Be in touch, follow us, support us. If you want to support us, share us with your friends and enemies. And with that,
Meghan Daum. All right, well, let's just kick us off. For those who may be less familiar with you and your work, I think Daum first encountered, or maybe not first, but kind of grappled with your work mostly with your book, The Problem with Everything, which you wrote, I believe, or you published in 2019. So for those who may not have read the book, would you mind giving the Cliff's Notes version of what it's about and the stories that you tell in that book?
Oh, and as we do, I will make every question a little more complicated so that you'll forget half of it, and then our listeners will be angry. I'll add that you're also now hosting the podcast.
Oh, yes, the Unspeakable podcast.
If you want, I'd love to also hear how somebody whose career focuses on the written word finds themselves
no longer writing.
Yes, no longer writing, retiring the word.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's I'm excited to talk with you. The Problem with Everything. Wow, that book had a long journey. It's my 6th book, and it is essentially a self-interrogation. It is an attempt for me as a Gen X woman who grew up with certain kinds of ideas and assumptions about women's opportunities and women's freedom, especially in the West. How I came to be a little bit puzzled with the way certain younger generations of women were seeing themselves in society, kind of around in 2014, 2015 or so. I noticed that there was a strange disconnect because even though women were doing really better than ever in the West, we were getting educated at higher rates. We were, economically empowered. Things like getting, higher, going to graduate school and even things like law school, sometimes medical school at higher rates than men. And boys were falling behind in a lot of ways. So with all of that going on sort of on the ground, there was this sort of narrative on social media and in legacy media increasingly as well that it had never been a worse time to be a woman, that the patriarchy had never been more oppressive. And, we suddenly had notions like toxic masculinity and mansplaining and all these portmanteaus came up. So I was
that's not specific only to feminism, right? It feels like there's just a general like a negativity around most anything. It feels like it's the worst time for anything in a lot of ways, right?
Pervasive whinginess.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. Right. But this was around, the woman conversation was really sort of starting to be the main thing. The race conversation hadn't yet kind of started bubbling up as much.
Right.
So in terms of the book, it started off as a manifesto. It was going to be called "You Are Not a Badass," and it was going to be kind of like just taking down this kind of rhetoric and this reductive narrative, and really looking at the state of women in reality versus what we were sort of seeing online. Then, please go ahead. There's no short answer to this question. Yes, please go ahead, and please interrupt me.
So, for you, growing up as a Gen Xer, what was the worldview that you had around being a woman in the world?
Oh, we could do anything. It was the free to be you and me era. So, I was born in 1970. It was the era of second wave feminism. The idea was that, girls could be anything we wanted. And I think more importantly, or actually, significantly, it was cool to be a tomboy. Like the girly girl aesthetic was kind of uncool. This was well before the age of the Disney princess. This was well before the age of raunch culture and, obviously ubiquitous pornography online. So I think it was a really sort of special window where we just had a sense of ourselves. Not everybody, of course, but I think a lot of us that we were just as good as boys, and it didn't even need to be pointed out. It was just a given. And then
so not badass, but just as bad. As bad.
Well, bad news bears. I mean, there just was a sense that we all were sort of the same. And in fact, I mean, I talk about this in the book. You did not have gendered toys back then as much as you have now. Obviously, there was G.I. Joe and there was Barbie, but you did not have like the, highly feminized pink toys versus highly masculinized toys. There was just a sense that we were all playing together, as in pre-adolescence anyway. And I think that and then that kind of morphed into when we were in our 20s. There was riot girl culture, and there was not a sense of being a victim at all in any way. And I was just puzzled when the victim narrative started to take center stage.
Okay, but it sounds like something happened more broadly at least in corporate culture. If you're saying that the feminized products didn't exist as much, the feminized identity didn't exist as much, not from the sense of feminism, but from a sense of femininity.
Mm-hmm. Well, like my idols growing up as a kid were like Spice Girls, which were very quite feminine,
girly,
but still girl power. But or at least the marketing said, but in a very girly way. Yes,
exactly.
So it sounds like whatever happened there, the current, I don't know the generation distinction exactly. It's a millennial, zillennial, fourth wave feminism sounds like, at least to some extent, is a response to that.
Well, there's third wave feminism that came after second wave. I mean, it's so hard to kind of categorize these things. So I think that, everything it comes in response to everything, right? So there was this kind of very second wave, hairy armpit kind of granola feminism that dominated in the 70s, and kind of, feminism got a bad name. You had a lot of people, in the 90s saying, well, I'm not a feminist, but so there was just kind of an earthy, hippie-ish aesthetic to feminism that was still pretty dominant through the 80s. That was the association with it. And so I do think that the girly girl stuff started to come up in reaction to that, the Disney princess phenomenon. I think a lot of baby boomer and older Gen X mothers they raised their own daughters in opposition to their mothers, so they kind of indulged a lot of the hyper girly culture. I mean, I see it in friends of mine. I mean, it's kind of uncanny. So various things were happening, but I think even more than that, I think just the rise of digital culture just made more media available to more people in more kinds of ways. And messages just got really confusing.
And confusing, because confusing how? I mean, I can think of many ways, but what are you imagining?
It would be easier. So, even though statistically women were doing better than ever. Okay. I mean, we know that for a fact. We know that boys are falling behind in education. We know that, the gender wage gap has to do with a motherhood penalty. It's not because there's some grand corporate conspiracy against women. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we know that the data shows. But because of social media and digital media, it's much easier for certain narratives to start circulating and then be sort of sanctioned as true. So even though the idea that women are paid 79 cents on the dollar has to do with a whole bunch of factors that have nothing to do with systemic sexism, really, the narrative was that women are discriminated against and we can't possibly compete with men and we're screwed no matter what, and we're going to make 79 cents on the dollar. That just became an article of faith. And it's really hard to compete with sanctioned cultural narratives. Facts have a really hard time competing with those.
For people who are not necessarily plugged into the discourse, what are the countervailing explanations for the 75 cents on the dollar?
Well, I mean, it's almost always because women, look, as I say, Mother Nature is the ultimate misogynist. The gender wage gap is a motherhood penalty. So women are more likely, first of all, to go into careers that have more flexibility. They're less likely to work the 80 hours a week that it would take to be, the president of a, CEO of a Fortune 500 company. As soon as women start having children, that's when their pay goes down. They leave the workplace to raise children, then they come back. It's harder to catch up. I'm not saying this is fair. It's horribly unfair, but it's a problem of biology. And the unwillingness to look at that, I think, is a problem.
Well, I guess it's a problem of biology and also the inflexibility of the systems that we have to accommodate for that biology.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that there's any. Yeah, but I'm not sure that that's solvable. Actually,
So this is actually, Vanessa is slipping into something that I find very interesting, and oh my God, this is a huge parenthetical conversation.
Right, we are going to get back to your book.
Aren't you glad we hit the ground running in this conversation? Yeah.
The whole question of to what extent can society tweak itself in order to accommodate for underlying inequities. That's one of the biggest, fundamental, most profound questions of political discourse, right? And the almost inherent requisite optimism of progressivism. I should say I'm not using this term pejoratively, but the true, honest progressive, a person who believes in the ability of planning society in a way that will better serve its weakest members, or not even the weakest, but people who are in some way disadvantaged. Mm-hmm. The idea is that we are logical enough, we are resourceful enough to be able to plan or create rules or regulate behavior in a way that will redress and prevent the inequities of society as it is. This requires some sort of metaphysical and temperamental optimism. So I think their response to this would be, oh, okay, so some women want to spend more time with their kids, so we create more accommodations for family leave. Right. Mm-hmm. And that is one way to put a patch on that aspect of nature that is problematic. And to some extent, there obviously are some policies that can be adopted that would improve inequities or maybe add a few cents to the discrepancy. But the fundamental question is, can you truly eradicate natural preferences? And I think that's where we're running into the weirder sides of the current progressive position, where people who have been so enamored with the idea that we can plan ourselves out of natural inequality or natural evils, have totally forgot that some things might be unfixable or irreducible.
Right.
Especially when things come really close to the heart of the human condition or the human code, like sex, it can get really uncomfortable, because that's where you start having the whole debate about how much of this is up for policymakers to fix, and how much of it is just hardwired misogyny.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, can you socially engineer biological imperative out of the culture, out of society, right? And you can't. I mean, I happen to be a huge proponent of universal daycare. I think that is essential, and I say that as somebody who doesn't have kids. I think that would help a lot. It would especially help working class women and lower class women. But the fact is that even in places like Scandinavia, which have incredible family leave policies and you know, universal health care and all kinds
And
of
parental leave, not
parental
just
leave.
maternal
Yeah,
leave.
exactly. And all kinds of social structures that progressives in this country aspire to. Women in those countries don't make significantly different choices about their careers than anyone else. Given the choice, they are still more likely to take a job with more flexible hours. They're more likely to want to be with their kids. That's just there's no evidence. They're more likely to go into the humanities than into the hard sciences. There's no evidence that having these benefits in place changes fundamental human behavior and choices.
Reminds me of one of the correspondences or debates between Rawls and Nozick, I think.
Two best friends of yours?
Yeah.
Who are those guys?
Oh, they're two political philosophers, American political philosophers. John Rawls created the famous thought experiment, the Veil of Ignorance, where all members of society come together to plan out what a good society is going to look like, what rules are going to govern it. But the trick is that they're all behind a veil of ignorance, not knowing what part they're going to play or be born into in the new society. They don't know their color, their race, their gender, their socioeconomic status. And the thought is that deprived of these of this prior knowledge, they can approximate the terms of a society that will work justly for everyone, or as close to it as possible. And he got a lot of criticism for aspects of this theory, and some of it, I think, was from Robert Nozick. And one of those criticisms was that you can't really thought experiment yourself out of the injustice of nature, the unjust inequality of nature, that is. And Rawls responded to that criticism saying, well, nature isn't just or unjust. It just is. What is just or unjust is how we respond to these inequalities.
Huh.
So as I see it, the problem happens when we start mistaking our ability to respond to some of these natural inequalities, when we start mistaking them for actually being able to eliminate those inequalities.
Yeah.
But there is still a way for us to actually think of how certain things that we're doing now are making things worse or are exacerbating existing disparities. Like there was this argument about male-dominated vocations, that the moment that women start being integrated into the workforce, they lose their social currency. They lose the value that they had. So it's not necessarily about the 25 missing cents on the dollar, but about some social mindsets that are more difficult to disentangle and more interesting to understand, that are interfering with the market.
Yeah, these things. Yeah, these things play off of each other, right? It's always yes and.
Right, right.
And it goes back and forth. But what I get frustrated with is just the oversimplification of the whole thing, and that's obviously the algorithm loves oversimplification.
Right.
I heard. Yeah, I think this a little bit related. I think I heard you say something on another podcast where you said something like nobody's subscribing to the "I'm not sure" show, something along those lines.
Oh, the I don't know show.
The
I know.
I don't know show.
The I don't know show does not have a huge audience.
Which tickled me because we're uncertain things. It's like we're essentially the I don't know show.
Okay, wow.
But it's kind of related. Like the algorithm does not give you these things. It gives you certainty. It gives you black and white. It gives you answers because that's what people crave, despite the fact that there aren't any really.
Right.
I mean, and I've spoken many times about my own experience with startup journalism and my attempt to create the I Don't Know show.
Right.
And how that went sour.
Oh.
back to your backstory. My
Yes,
backstory
back
is
to the
irrelevant.
book.
So we stopped at when the title was still "You're Not a Badass."
You are not a badass.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And then obviously the social justice conversation started expanding beyond women's issues, and it became, there was stuff about race and there was stuff about gender in terms
And-
of, yeah, go ahead. Uh-huh.
And this is all happening while you're writing it?
Oh
Like,
yeah,
what are-
no, this
like-
was the most miserable writing experience of my life. So I started writing the book in 2016. It was going to be called "You Are Not a Badass." Then I assumed Hillary Clinton was going to be elected president. I thought,
Right.
well, this will just be funny because, people will be able to handle this because we're going to have a woman president and it's going to be fine. Okay, so that obviously did not happen, and there wasn't a huge appetite for, complaining about, women being, saying that women were not being trampled upon. So then Trump comes in, and then the Me Too movement arises, and everything just kind of absolutely explodes. Everybody's outraged about a million different things all the time. So then I was going to make it more about the kind of disconnect between a certain kind of social justice culture and, again, reality. And I was joking that it was going to be called "Woke Me When It's Over." That I never really thought that should be the title, but my agent thought it should be the title, and several other people did too. And then ultimately, I just I thought
And that
the
was
problem
before the whole cottage industries of books with woke in their title, right?
This book is so short. I think for every page that is now in the book, I probably threw away 20 pages. It was like writing in reverse. It was like writing back. It was the most miserable experience, and because it just kept evolving and it kept changing, and
You're trying to capture a moving target.
yeah,
basically.
exactly. And so I really just it was much more reported in places for a while, and like I wanted to talk about like the Google memo, the James Damore case, and but then editors were like, don't do that, and then it kind of this had a changed editors. So ultimately it's, like I said, it is a self-interrogation. It is me as a 50-year-old woman, then 49, trying to look at what I am not understanding about the current conversation around a lot of issues, particularly feminism, and why that is, and how we might reconcile them. So that's really all it is.
Are you glad that you finished it before the pandemic?
Well, I'm glad because I got to go on book tour. Yeah, I'm glad it came out before the pandemic because I got to go. It came out in October of 2019, and it was a strange experience because it's my sixth book. I have been somebody who's been embraced by the literary world and the legacy media, and I've been in the New Yorker and I've been in the New York Times, and like I've won, been on the judging panels and won awards, and I was just considered I was a member of the literary world in good standing. And as soon as this book came out, my membership was revoked. And that's not the same as being canceled, by the way. I am not canceled in any way. But it was just I had never been sort of eviscerated in polite media the way I was when the book came out. So
what did that look like? Was that reviews? Was that just
Yeah.
like not being invited to things? Like, what did that look like?
There were, it was some reviews. It was mostly just my, a lot of people on, I hate to say it, on Twitter, which does matter. That's where everybody gathers. A lot of people, just talking about how disappointed they were in me, how, just that they felt betrayed because they had been a fan, and how could I possibly become this kind of person, that I had been red pilled in some way, that and it was a gross misunderstanding of what I was trying to do. But of course, that's how everything is responded to. So I wasn't surprised. I wasn't surprised at all.
What was there something specific that was a sticking point for your readers, something that kept coming up again? How could you say that? Or was it just the vague impression that you were now part of the red pill crowd?
It was definitely the vague impression, because I don't really think that they could point to anything. I mean, there's a moment in the book where I say something like, "Oh, am I missing something here? Am I getting this wrong? Like, do I have a substantive gripe, or am I just saying, is this just some version of get off my lawn?" Again, it's like the self-reflection. And the review in the New Yorker was, Meghan Daum says to millennials, "Get off my lawn."
Right.
So
Right.
that was basically the tone, the nature of the response. Not by everybody. It got some good reviews. And look, again, it was a New York Times notable book. It got a nice review in the New York Times. I am not by any means saying it was, you know, overwhelmingly poorly received. Not at all. But it definitely made people mad. And certainly I lost some friends, and I had some scowling people. But overall, the book events were filled with people who were saying, "Thank you for writing this. Oh my God.
Mm.
These are the things I can't say out loud. Thank you, thank you, thank you." So there was a giant disconnect between what I was seeing on Twitter and what I was seeing on the ground when I was going around promoting the book.
I also I want to remember to get back to your emphasis that you weren't canceled, because I appreciated that, and I just want to hear what your definition of being canceled is, if at all, if something does constitute that word, or if it's total garbage word, which is something that I'm also struggling with a lot, like trying to kind of like catalog it. But before that, what you said about the type of criticism that you got, it's interesting because it's not the total evisceration or trying to totally destroy your career, but it was more in the lines of trying to just dismiss the arguments as kind of unserious, get off my lawn, old generation griping.
Yes,
which
exactly.
which there needs to be a study about how a culture, when it tries to push back against internal criticisms, the sort of tactics that it adopts to dismiss it. Getting too acrid in response to internal criticism can be counterproductive. But then there's a softer style of dismissiveness. And that's the kind of, oh, you're not saying anything new, it's not something special, it's not really important, or you're just being bitter, and just like not taking your criticism seriously. So it kind of gives people the permission to just roll their eyes and not really grapple with the substance of the criticism,
or act harmed by it. And I'm not just talking about myself. I'm talking about anybody who has spoken up about the kind of censorious nature of the culture and their own self-censorship. Anything from the Harper's letter to various articles that people have published talking about this. It's not that it's dismissible; it's that somehow it's offensive, like as if it's somehow doing harm to point these things out. And getting back to your question about whether cancellation is a real thing, it's absolutely a real thing.
Oh no, I wasn't doubting that
100%.
there wasn't doubting that's a real thing. I was doubting what the term is useful for. I have no doubt that cancellation is a thing, and we have like long running arguments on this pod for me being like, no, it's something that should be taken very, very seriously. But I do find it difficult to kind of draw the line of what is, what isn't, where something really is culturally corrosive and where something is just pushback.
Right.
When
right.
every pushback can immediately turn into a Twitter mob, because that's what the current state of technology combined with human nature enables right now, and it just becomes difficult to draw a line between what's a backlash that went out of hand, or an actual fundamental problem that we have with growing illiberalism and censoriousness. So that's what I'm trying to get at. Not at all to dismiss. Like, I just take for granted that that we have a problem with cancel culture. So my question is, like, why you took yourself out of the equation of being canceled. You said I wasn't canceled with this.
No.
So you have an idea, you have a model in your mind of what the line between being canceled and not being canceled is. So I'd like to hear that.
Well, I mean, just speaking for myself, I still walk the earth. I still have a career. I've pivoted in my career, but I think that's mostly just because of the business model has changed. It's not like I'm being prevented from saying anything. I mean, I could say whatever I want. That doesn't mean that the old places are going to publish it, but there are plenty of places where I can, I could put up a blog post. I could put something on medium. I could do whatever I want. So it's I think that it's mostly that increasingly there are certain talking points that you have to adhere to. There are certain kinds of there's a party line that has to be towed, and that if you stay within those bounds, you will consistently write for the New York Times. You will be covered on NPR. You will be considered for certain prizes. You will be invited to lecture at certain places. And if you're out of those bounds, you won't be. However, increasingly, lots and lots of people are out of those bounds. More journalists and writers and thinkers are stepping out of those bounds every day. So I think pretty soon we're going to see a kind of recalibration.
So when you're making this, so you write your book and then you're pivoting to this podcast. That's then
Wait.
not.
Are you changing the subject?
No, it's in reflection.
Oh, it's in
to
reflection
to
to
what
this.
you
Okay.
said. Yeah,
Okay. Sorry.
Because
I
I'm
love
wondering-
that there's two of you. This is like when I ask my questions, I have this all going on in my head. Like, wait, why did you ask? Why did you back up, lady? Okay.
Yeah,
sorry.
we're constantly doing back up. Wait, go
Okay.
back. Wait, go
Okay.
forward. So are you reflecting on the experience of the book? And you're thinking not so much like, oh, I'm not going to be accepted if I write another book. I'm not going to be in the kind of the mainstream narratives that would get the accolades that I would have gotten before. Therefore, I'm going to opt to do something more independent in the podcast. It's kind of like preempting cancellation in a way. Was that kind of like your thought process?
No. I had wanted to do a podcast for a really long time. And I mean, it's mostly like we'll just get back to I just want to make something really clear about the book. I mean, I was interviewed by NPR for the book. It was reviewed in places. In no way was this a canceling event. The book was polarizing, and it was nuanced, and it was a little bit complicated for people, and it made a lot of I found a lot of new readers, and it disappointed some old readers. That's really the extent of it. I'm not canceled. I just reviewed a book for the New York Times Book Review a few weeks ago. Like, in no way am I persona non grata in any sort of meaningful way. I just want to be really clear about that. What I don't get is, I used to do a lot of speaking events. Let's just put it that way. I don't get invited to those anymore. But that could be because of the pandemic. That could be because of my demographic. There could be a million reasons for that, and it might not have to do with my sort of ideology, which, by the way, hasn't changed. I mean, The Problem with Everything is my most gentle, least controversial book that I've ever written. I mean, that's what's amazing, is that I have been so much more kind of in your face and counterintuitive in the past. So that's another kind of strange aspect to this. But no, the podcast, I'm the biggest cliche in the world. I started the podcast during the pandemic when everybody else started a podcast.
Including us.
Yeah. And it was because I had always wanted to do an interview show. I love interviewing people. I used to do a lot of it on stage. I would do live events, and I love talking with people. And I was just, again, frustrated that there were topics out there that were either not being covered in the mainstream sphere or being covered in this kind of didactic, overly dogmatic way in the so-called alternative media space. So I had my ideas about how to do things right, and so I wanted to do that.
What are topics that you currently hold as the interesting ones, the ones that aren't being talked about?
Well, I have done a lot of stuff about gender ideology, because that's something that I think is incredibly nuanced, incredibly complicated, and that nobody is getting right for the most part. It's being reduced to it's really being oversimplified on the left and the right, and I think that a lot of the usual suspects, people who have been talking about it, who have big platforms when they're talking about it, I think they do a good job up to a point. but I still want more nuance there. So I've done a number of interviews on that subject, and I bring in people who I think can really speak to this in a way that's productive and informed. So that's something. Uh, what else? I mean, I did an interview about incels. That's a topic that I think is poorly understood and has been misrepresented in the media. This, incel stands for involuntary celibate, and it's this kind of subculture, sort of Reddit culture of mostly young men online who feel that they just haven't had luck with women romantically. And so, and there's all kinds of men in this space, and they have a variety of gripes, and it's pretty diverse actually, but somewhere along the way it got reduced to a terrorist organization, almost a hate group, and that's really not the case. So I had a woman named Nama Cates on the show who has a podcast called Incel. And she's really, really interesting the way she talks about this phenomenon. So, for instance, I did an episode on that. So things like that.
This is a nice example because incels are one of those cultural phenomenons that come into the spotlight when some event calls for it. Like, what was it? There was a
there was the
attack. Was it in
attack.
Canada?
Yeah, that was the Alex Manisian. I can't remember how to pronounce his name, but yeah, that was
it was
Alec.
like a truck.
It was a van. I think it was a van. He rammed a van into a bunch of people.
Right. Suddenly, the word incel was in public attention, and then completely colored by that experience, because that is incel. Incel is basically the jihadists of sex or something, right?
Yeah, right.
And then
right.
just as quickly, basically all interest in the subject disappeared. And it's telling because it's a media culture that loves excoriating others whenever they seem to be employing cheap stereotypes or oversimplified narratives about other cultures and communities.
Right.
But if it's a community that runs afoul of media narratives, like incels were poster children for toxic masculinity. So in this case, let the stereotypes and oversimplification go wild. And the thing is that after that moment, I don't think you saw any serious coverage of incel culture in the media. And I guess I'm partly to blame because I didn't show any interest in it. And I think I was working at CNN at the time, so I'm really to blame.
Well, you got to get some new hobbies. What can I say?
And I actually knew a guy who self-identified as an incel, and I guess I never took it seriously at the time. I always saw it as more of kind of a, like men rights curious type, maybe being a little bit provocative intentionally. But, I guess it shows how easy it is to not take subcultures seriously. Subcultures that you don't understand.
Yeah, and it's always more complicated. I mean, obviously, if you are going to commit an act of mass violence, you've got a lot going on. There's a lot of stuff wrong with you.
Right.
And it's not just being an incel. Like that's
right.
There's a lot going on. So let's be serious here, right.
And whatever the reality is, it probably being an incel probably means more to the person who identifies as that than just, I'm just going to open up all my bottled up grievances, find the first beauty parlor, and shoot up some Asian women.
Right.
However absurd or repugnant or weird you might find the internal logic of these communities, it's probably more complicated than you think, and it's definitely worth understanding.
Yes. Well, and it's necessary to understand it, I would say. Because if you want to do anything to try to mitigate it, you have to understand what it actually is.
Right.
Whereas the typical, I guess, left-leaning response would just be to essentially not just ignore, but like kind of relegate it to a kind of fringe element of like dangerous, and just therefore let's just not talk about it at all because it's just, this is beyond the pale. We're not going to talk about it. This is like, don't even ask what it is. It's just bad. And then that's reductionist.
And to be fair, reductionism is by no means solely the purview of the left.
No.
The right is much better at it and gets a lot more traction out of it.
Right, exactly. It's the entire business model of right-wing media for the past 30 years.
Exactly.
It's just it's more predictable when it comes from the right, and it's more embarrassing because there's a self-righteousness and a pretension to not be doing that on the left. That's the thing.
Yeah, well, we expect more from the left.
No, but the left expects more of itself, just not even us. Like I always say, like, yeah, we expect more of the left, which is absolutely true. But also the left pretends to be more than that. The right does not pretend to be above otherizing people, right? The left does. The left talks about otherizing as if that's a bad thing.
Mm.
And then deploys its own version of it.
Right. And the left, basically controls the culture. It controls, the sensibility of liberalism, or what we used to think of liberalism, progressivism. That is the dominant one in the entertainment industry, in academia, in the arts, and culture, right? And in most news organizations. So, the Republicans may be in control politically, especially on state levels, but the left controls the culture. And so that's pretty powerful.
Though I wonder how much, with that control, it's a question that's now being tested. How much is that cultural control real? Or how much is it just a control of certain centers of institutional power? But the culture itself, if we think of it more democratically, I hardly believe really falls behind what coastal progressives see as their lodestar. And, defund the police is the classic example, or school masking, or so many things that were taken as progressive right think in the past 2 years. When put to the test, the culture rejected.
Yeah. With those examples, yeah. I mean, those are pretty easy to reject at the end of the day. But, I've been thinking a lot about, stuff like the homeless situation. I mean, you have massive influxes of homeless people on the streets, in places like Seattle and San Francisco and Los Angeles. And that's because of local politics. That's because of policy that's being made on a local level by progressive officials. And that's, I think, something that really needs to be explored.
Yeah, it's the failure of democratic institutions.
Yeah, and that exactly, and it has real impact. I mean, I have been living in New York City for the last 5 years. When I came back to New York, I lived there in the 90s, and then I was in Los Angeles for a long time. But when I came back to New York in 2015, it was like Disney World. Like, I couldn't believe it. Like, the New York of the 90s was absolutely gone. It had been radically changed by, Michael Bloomberg, and just a different kind of local administration. And by the time I left a couple months ago, it was incredible. I mean, the crime was rampant, homeless people everywhere, people on the subway, people being pushed on the subway. And, this is nothing new. People, I'm not saying anything people haven't heard mostly, but this is because of the way decisions are being made along progressive lines. And it's no surprise that now there's a mayor who's very, very different than that. People don't like it. But I guess my point is that it does have effects. I mean, the defund the police is kind of a joke, but when you have, policy, happening that is making, causing there to be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of homeless people, with major psychiatric problems and doing drugs on the street, that's a real thing.
It reminds me, I tweeted a couple of weeks ago a headline from the New York Times, and I'm not exaggerating. It was something like, Mayor Eric Adams, and to whoever is not paying attention to New York politics, he was obviously still a Democrat, but much more moderate, certainly conservative on issues of policing. He came from the police.
Yeah.
And as Meghan said, New York in the past 2 years has experienced a massive jump in crime rates. A friend of mine was just punched in the face while walking home through the subway the other day. It's it's a story that everybody just is experiencing now constantly. And this was not the case only 3 years ago. So the New York Times published a headline that was something like, sorry, I can't say it without laughing. Eric Adams ran on fighting crime. Now, 2 weeks into his tenure, crime still hasn't decreased, or something like that.
Oh. Recall, and we need a recall immediately.
Yeah, I think my tweet was something like Eric Adams ran on fighting crime, the rapid increase of which has been consistently denied on these very pages.
Right.
It's crazy. Like the New York Times has published so many op-eds in the past 2 years combating people who were talking about the rise in crime, as if they are just playing into conservative talking points.
As if it's racist to talk about rising crime. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the insane thing, because you know that this is the sort of thing that is not going to go well with anybody except for the people writing those op-eds, because the people are going to read it and say, no, that's enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
To people who are actually worried about leaving their house, it doesn't matter how you're going to package your story. They're not going to give a crap.
But I do think that there's a difference, like what Meghan was talking about, the left kind of controlling the cultural narratives, right? As opposed to, I think people are quite fed up with liberal policy because they're proving out to be quite ineffective. Things like the way that they're tackling homelessness, like liberal cities are just getting overrun right now and clearly aren't prepared to deal with the ways of the influx of growth, of gentrification, of rising prices. So, but there's a division there that I'm seeing between like policy and cultural narratives. There seems to be much more straightforward acceptance of left-leaning cultural narratives as opposed to left-leaning policies that one can witness in their day-to-day life as ineffective. Am I wrong there?
Until these cultural things start running against your real life, because
until then,
no,
yes.
But that's the thing.
But I'm not sure if that's happened yet for most people.
But I think so. For instance, with racism, after George Floyd, people were happy to accept whatever convention or doctrine was publicly presented as the adequate academic definition of who or what constitutes racism. That's why Robin DiAngelo had a moment. But the moment that you start calling people racist for talking about crime in their neighborhood, when those neighborhoods are often, majority Asian or majority Hispanic, and almost entirely working class neighborhoods, and you're saying that they're racist for worrying, this is when your quote unquote cultural tropes run against people's reality, and they're like, you know what, go fuck yourselves.
There is a huge division in newsrooms between the older cohorts who really have ideas about journalism that are pretty consistent with what we have historically viewed as the role of journalism, which is to find out the facts, and younger cohorts who really see it as a form of activism, and they truly believe it. I don't think they're disingenuous, but what we have all over the place. I don't know of a single newsroom who isn't just mightily struggling with this right now.
Right.
Is real sense that the younger the younger reporters and editors not only feel very strongly about this, they know that they have a lot of power now. I mean, all they need to do is accuse the older people of being bigoted in some ways, and the older people will fold. I mean, they are scared. They're terrified of being accused of something, being accused of being racist or just being painted that way. And, you can lose your job over that. And that is, I'm not saying losing your job in and of itself is cancellation, but losing your livelihood is pretty close.
Right. You had a quote in some sort of interview that I read, I think in maybe Reason, and you said if 2018 was the year that the concept of cancel culture went mainstream, then 2019 may be the year that cancel culture cancels itself. So clearly that was a little bit of a accelerated timeline, maybe optimistic prediction.
I think that was
there
a while ago. Yeah, I know, right? I know. Oh,
how do you see? I mean, do you see this? Do you see that still though as the inevitable conclusion though? Like, even if it will happen, if not, this year or next year, that it will cancel culture will have to cancel itself?
Oh God, I don't know. I mean, I had to write a new foreword for the paperback edition to The Problem with Everything. And yeah, I said, I it was really like, oh God, when the pandemic started, I thought, okay, great.
Well, this goes back to my earlier question. Yeah.
I was like, great, because now we have a real problem on our hands. Like we've got this, the stakes are real here. And so let's move away from the culture wars and actually tackle this. And of course, fool me 5 times.
If anything, the target started moving even faster,
yeah.
right? Like if you had been writing this over the pandemic, good Lord, it would have been It would have had to be
Oh.
a blog, right? Like, how do you even crystallize that into a book
No,
form?
I know. I mean, there's so much. And the thing is, like, especially now with Trump gone, all the energy that went into blaming him for everything and obsessing about him and just making him the boogeyman for every possible aspect of life, you take that away and you've got to put that energy onto something else. So, it's just like people who, you know, the fact that we're still, demonizing people for their opinion about masks, it's just if Trump were still around, I don't know. I don't even know what I'm saying. It's such a mess. I honestly, like, I was an opinion columnist at the LA Times for 10 years. I have basically been writing opinions on a deadline for most of my decades long career. I am so happy not to be doing it anymore. Honestly, I think that increasingly, like I say in the book, if you're not conflicted, you're either lying or you're not very smart. And everything is just I'm so conflicted about everything that I don't think I'm not a very good pundit these days.
This is such a good line, and I think I've previously conveyed similar sentiments, but probably with more swear words. It's it's funny because for us, when in this conversation and implicit in the names of our respective podcasts, the whole point of being conflicted, of looking into the paradoxical and unresolvable nature of things, is where things are interesting and where things are worthwhile. It's
Right.
when things are resolved, like the laws of gravity. That's not
Not
that's
so
not,
fast, Mister. Gravity is I think that's part of the that's part of the cis hetero patriarchy, don't you know? Gravity, that's
that's true.
white supremacy. Gravity is white supremacy.
That's true. It
Apparently.
relies on, no, it relies on math, and math is
That's right.
is a white artifact. But yeah, so aside for white artifacts like mathematics, my point about resolved things is when something is actually resolved, it's usually less interesting.
Yeah.
Presumably, people who go into journalism are driven by curiosity and wanting to explore things. That's, people like to tag writers like you as provocateurs, because you go and find conversations that are at the edges of accepted debate. But that's the point. Curiosity leads you to explore the taboos and try to understand them, not necessarily to legitimize all of it, but at least to understand what's going on there.
Yeah.
Something that I grew up taking for granted as the role of a journalist. I want to see those dark recesses of human behavior. But at the same time, it just seems that there is closing of ranks around certain ideologies and certain positions, which become increasingly inflexible.
Right.
It's a badge of honor to stick to your guns, no matter how much reality is changing around you. I don't know if it's social media or what, but it's a general shrinking of minds.
Yeah, that's very well put. There's a closing of ranks around certain ideas. I mean, but it's like what you're saying. I became a writer because I wanted to explore counterintuitive ideas. I wanted to be surprising. And that was the job. Like, I was rewarded for that. And I got traction in my career by writing essays that sort of invited my reader to think alongside me as I kind of sorted through ideas in a new way or surprising way. If it's never about being right, I'm not really interested in making an argument. I'm interested in inviting my reader to come with me. It's an offering, not an argument. It's a suggestion. And that was like the name of the game up until 6 or 7 years ago. And now it's like the opposite of the job. And so that's the thing. It's like, I find it amazing because if anybody, my book, The Unspeakable, which the podcast is actually named after the book I published in 2014, an essay collection called The Unspeakable, that has some really, raw stuff in there. Like there's some difficult material in there. And it's like people love that book. The people who can't stand me now are like fans of that book and remain so. And I want to say, like, have you like opened that book lately? Because I mean, you wouldn't like it if it was published now. You'd hate it. But it like won awards. It's crazy.
to be fair, the people who are really, really into hunting people's past or sifting through people's past, they would happily go back to the Unspeakable and find the right lines and then share it.
I know.
Well, she told us who she was back in 2014.
Exactly.
So, I mean, something that Daum and I have been thinking about a lot is this idea of like where we are at as a culture, but potentially in the wake of the withdrawal of religion, actually. So we've been thinking about this as like, can we draw a line to the decline of religion in American society, to this kind of sense of loss of meaning, this sense of there's a kind of void in people's lives, not just on a spiritual level, but on like a communal level. And can we locate some of the behaviors that we're seeing in that sense of loss and searching? And so that can be kind of like holding on to political narratives, kind of groups clinging on to this kind of black and white thinking. And I'm just curious to get your read on this idea that we've been toying with. Like, do you also sense that there's kind of a deeper, the kind of spiritual and social kind of depravity happening that is perhaps at the root of some of what we're seeing these
Depravity
days?
in the sense of deprivation, right? Not
Right,
in
or
the sense
just
of
a-
moral.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
Well,
correct, sorry.
there's a depravity of meaning. I mean,
Yeah.
there's or the legitimacy crisis. I like to think of it that way too. But it's funny. I feel like I asked this exact question to somebody I had on my podcast, and it was like it was somebody who it was appropriate to ask them this question. I don't know if they were a religious. I mean, I want to say maybe it was John McWhorter, because he always talks about how wokeness is a new religion, and I
Right.
asked him like if he thought that this was because of a kind of poverty of a lack of meaning coming from traditional religion. And I think whoever it was, I don't remember. This is great, huh? Great answer. If it was him, whoever it was, they said no. They said the answer to that question is no. And that's it's kind of, that would be a kind of convenient narrative, but that wasn't really the case. Now, I'm like not somebody who thinks about religion a lot. I did not grow up with any religion. I think of this more in terms of loneliness. I think people do this because they're lonely and they want affiliation. Now, you could call that tribalism. That's another word that is in heavy rotation in this ecosystem. But I think they just want to feel like they're part of a group, and that their friend group accepts them, and that they're in good standing. It's like a club, really. I mean, maybe it's not just that there's a lack of religious practice in the West. It's that there's not like clubs. I'm honestly thinking out loud here. Like, is this replacing, the Girl Scouts and then
The Explorers Club.
Yeah, or is it replacing like people would have or like you're in like the Masons, or like the Elks Club, or the Women's Club, the League of Women Voters. I mean, and the thing is, people do have book clubs, but I hear from so many a lot of the people who write to me. It's funny, especially the women, because I have a lot of women writing to me and saying like, God, I thank you for doing what you do, and I just feel like I've alienated my friends. Like, heterodox thinking in my world is, there's not a lot of it, and a lot of it is stuff that started disagreements that came up in book clubs.
Right.
Oh, wow.
I believe that. No, I 100% believe that. Because books bring out like all these complicated, difficult topics, and it's generally a group of women. Mothers for the most part, but not necessarily
who are drinking, by the way.
Yeah.
There's always alcohol involved.
Very likely, and maybe baked goods, whatever it might be. But like often who stick to the script, right? And who believe and defend the script. And it's not really about having deep, meaningful conversations about the book. That's kind of like potentially like 10%. And so I could totally imagine that being that one woman there who wants to like dig in and uncover and discuss, and being just completely shut down and anathema.
Yeah, you don't understand what this community is about. It's not really about the text of the book.
Right. Read the room. Read the room. Like that's a horrible expression that I hear it more and more. Like, the real crime was that, this person didn't read the room. We're going after this person in their job and digging up dirt on them, not necessarily because they did anything actually actionable, but that we don't like this person because they don't read the room.
But that's the thing, like, you'd think that the book club could be a place where you can meet with people and discuss real things and without fear of censorship or censure from the others around you. And it's actually not. We're just replicating the
Yeah.
same
It's
beats and rules essentially of like the Twitterverse
Right.
in real life. So then there's this where do you go feeling, right?
I'd say the Twitterverse is replicating the small suburb, the Calvinist community where everybody is looking at each other's windows and judging their every minute's behavior. The panopticon is very real and important for some communities, and that's what keeps them together. It keeps them in order. It's the origin of NIMBYism is
Right.
that property value.
But then it turns into the next door site, right?
Right. And then Twitter makes it into like the next continent. You're starting to judge people in the other side of the world for not living by your own group standards and norms. Which brings us back to my problem with social media is that it gave scale to one of the least charming aspects of human social building.
Right. But it's also, again, I think this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning. Is this just human nature? Like, can you socially engineer tribalism out of a human civilization?
Right.
Well, we just had the conversation with Jacob Mishangama about free speech, and we kind of hit on this point again and again and again, which is free speech is not natural. It is not. Humans are not good at it, and we've had to create kind of institutions, cultural values that reinforce it. But if you don't do all those things, it falls apart very, very quickly. And he kind of shows throughout history all the times that free speech has just crumbled upon pressure. But that's kind of what societal values are a lot. It's just things that are in the ether that we have to continually bolster.
Right.
Otherwise,
Norms.
that's kind of all it is.
Yeah.
Which is scary.
Yeah. But, there are more of these communities coming up, as sort of alternative to your local book, your regular book club. There are communities like Persuasion, there's Heterodox Academy. There are Heterodox.
Your Patreon.
Yeah.
And
actually one of the things I really want to do, and I'm working on this, is creating a heterodox community for women, because it's a very male dominated space. And I don't think, I'm interested in obviously like everybody, but I get so many women coming to me and saying like, I feel like I can't, I feel like I've lost friends, and women are much more sensitive to the social penalties of speaking out than men are on balance, not everyone, but I think that this kind of dissident thinking plays out differently in female groups than it does in male groups or mixed groups.
Interesting. Would you want to expand on that a little?
Well, I mean, this idea, just there aren't a lot of women in the kind of, whatever IDW heterodox space. There's like Barry Weiss, there's Katie Herzog, there's me, there's a handful of us, but it's way, way, way male dominated. I mean, there's Sam Harris, and there's the Weinstein brothers, and there's go down the list. There are very few women. And I think, this is something that I actually talked with Heather Hying about. She was the first guest ever on the Unspeakable podcast. And we talked about why that might be. At that time, when I had her on it was 2020 that I started the podcast day. I would like to know how many podcasts launched on like July 27th, 2020. I don't know why the internet didn't like shut down. Like, it's like 55,000 new podcasts today. At that time, she and Brett were doing the Dark Horse podcast. They were gaining massive traction talking about COVID in a way that was really interesting and productive at that point. But you still would Google her name and she would come up as Brett Weinstein's wife. And, we talked about why that might be. And, we just, said, like, is there a reason, women are sort of inclined to smooth over a social situation? We're not going to be the ones that disrupt the dinner party by saying, wait a second, wait. Like, it's not that simple, folks. And, risk making people feel uncomfortable. I think we're just less likely to be willing to do that. And those of us who are willing to do it, there's maybe something, we're outliers. So anyway, that's something I think about a lot. Is
it internal, or do you feel like there's also some or experience some stigma against
it's always
being the
both.
person?
Again, it's so hard to know. I mean, this is like a lot of these evolutionary psychology conversations. The reason Evo Psych has such a bad reputation is because it just gets bastardized and reduced and weaponized to silliness. But there's validity there. I mean, our brains respond. Societal norms get set up because there is some kind of biological imperative that's governing a lot of our behavior. I think that for instance, like, there's this idea that women are treated badly on social media, that women are receive more threats, or are somehow it's dangerous for them to be on social media. And that's actually, I'm pretty sure that the data shows that that's not true. It's that women are more sensitive to being attacked on social media.
I would have assumed. So I don't know which one is true, but even if we take it for granted that it's the same amount of trolling, but my assumption would be just that it's a different type. Like, women are going to be attacked for different types of things than men are. Is my assumption. Like, I think we talked to Lindsay Ellis about this too. It's like, you might just be like, you're ugly and fat, go die.
Yeah.
Versus if it's a dude, it's like, I hate you, go kill it yourself.
Or like you're, or emasculating men. I mean,
right.
being homophobic.
Right.
I mean, there's
millions of ways to be nasty.
There's millions of ways. And I mean, it's like, just because men and women don't suffer oppression in the same ways doesn't mean we both don't suffer oppression. I mean, I remember saying just very casually to some grad students one day, I said, historically, it was just assumed that a lot of women were going to die in childbirth and a lot of men were going to die in wars. Like, and they were like, what? They had never thought about that. But the idea that there could be something that was, a real injustice, that men would be burdened with something just systemically that was so violent and dangerous and unfair, that never crossed their mind.
Right.
That also goes on the tangent of the peace privilege that I think is a big issue with kind of our cultural.
I've never
stupidity.
heard that expression before, but yeah, that makes perfect sense.
I literally just coined it, but
brilliant. Oh my God, get on that now.
I mean, coming from Israel, I think that's something that's very, very like obvious when you see it, and especially talking about like in recent events in kind of the cultural response to Ukraine. Just to hijack the conversation there for a second, it's the way that the American conversation about Ukraine is being handled is basically the textbook definition of my little sniglet, what I call peace privilege. You're talking about sanctions as the way they would talk about trying to cancel Tucker Carlson, right?
Right.
Both from the right and the left. Like, the right is complaining that they're trying to cancel Russia, and the left literally is trying to cancel Russia. But nobody really has any perspective in terms of what war really entails, or what are the consequences of not getting involved in a meaningful way. Because just the idea of actually having security and safety, real safety, not imagined safety, or not like you made us watch Team America and it made us feel unsafe. Kind of safety, but real.
Those are all war survivors that were in that class. So, yeah, very, very much so.
That it's something that's just does not really exist in people raised in current liberal societies. That's because of the success of liberal societies. It's a good thing.
Exactly.
But it's it's coming to bite them in the ass, culturally, psychologically.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm reading everything I can about the Russia-Ukraine situation, but I am not going to opine on that. There's nothing I can say that, hasn't been said and better. Yeah.
No, yeah, no. I also have no idea what the right thing to do. I wouldn't dare to presume, but
There's the I don't know show. You just lost like hundreds of listeners.
Yeah.
Wait, you don't know? You were not going to say anything? Goodbye. Yes.
yeah, like I'm just embarrassed by the way that the conversation is being run. Last week, the news coverage was dominated by celebrating all the chains that were leaving Moscow as, oh, bravo, the brave exodus
brave
of corporate
H&M.
America. Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God. Oh God.
There was a moment in time where if you go through all the big news websites, Washington Post, New York Times, Politico, The Hill, the first story you'd see would be McDonald's and Starbucks join chains in leaving Russia. Wow, Putin really should have thought it through. He really did.
Yeah, right. This will get him.
And that's what drives me crazy. This is the only way, the only prism through which we can talk about anything these days. It's not about lives being sacrificed. It's not about the values that we are trying to preserve. It's not about the global order. It's not about what we're passing on to future generations. It's about who's banning who, what corporation is on which side, and who's getting to score more political points. That's it. Okay, before we run out of time, you mentioned the IDW as kind of a response to loneliness.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it goes to what Vanessa called it religion, or the absence of religion. I would probably call it our cultural absence of purpose or meaning or community. Religion is just one form of it that I think just dominated American culture throughout history, but other cultures find that kind of group purpose in different ways. But you were describing how in the mid 2000 teens, going through your own travails, you found meaning, comfort, and emotional substance in all those heterodox communities, something that went beyond people who are talking about something that others don't touch, but more personal, right? So can you talk about it a little bit? Assuming that it doesn't bore you to talk about it for like the nth time.
No, so as long as it doesn't bore everybody else. So, yeah, I was separated from my husband in 2015, and for all of our problems in the marriage, we were really intellectual allies. We still are. He was just over. I'm dog sitting the dog as we speak. But we were both journalists. We were very much on the same page about a lot of these issues. And we really thought a lot of our friends were too, for a long time. And so, when we split up, it happened to coincide with the time when a lot of these people that, sort of public thinkers and journalists and media people were suddenly like lining up, kind of just towing this very, very simplistic, progressive, identity-based narrative. And I found myself feeling alienated from a lot of my friends. And so, and certainly, and I didn't have my husband to come home and talk to about all this stuff. So I found myself watching, it started with Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter on bloggingheads.tv. They would have these conversations about race, among other things, that were like riveting, just so nuanced. There's the word. And so I watched that, and then the algorithm kind of took me along. I found
we did a good job surviving a whole
people.
Conversation without saying nuance, I think. So good job.
I think I might have said it before, but yeah, you can bleep that. So yeah, and I found
it would be funny if we bleeped nuanced and then you kept as fuck.
The unusable words are, I think, heterodox, nuance, and dangerous ideas. Those are banned.
But so, I have seen people like nuance has been weaponized now, because I've seen people like associate the word nuance with some kind of like alt-right adjacent thing, because they like, another nuanced take, like that's just a dog whistle for the alt-right. Yeah.
Right, you know what other word starts with N, right?
Oh God.
Oh no.
I mean, there was a time where you had had the memes of like debate me was considered a right-wing trope, right?
Right. Come debate me. Yeah. Well, it was very masculine. It was very violent. I think that was that was something that Ben Shapiro would say a lot, or like Dave Rubin. So speaking of, yeah, so right, just to go back. So yeah, I found like Sam Harris and Dave Rubin at that time was having good conversations with people.
Yeah, that moment of his awakening from
yeah. So
the Young Turks.
Anyway, so yeah, I kind of stumbled into that universe, and I became, it was there was solace there, and there was company, and I'm not alone in that experience. I mean, I wrote a big piece about it, and many people have said that they had a similar kind of journey.
I was telling you that in our pre-interview call that I just moved to New York around that same time, like 2015, 2014. And my mom, who had just broke up with her boyfriend at the time, was alone back in Jerusalem, and I was here alone in this awful city that I call home. And that was the moment that I basically discovered podcasting. Partly was because of Vanessa's malign influence on me. But setting aside all the philosophical, intellectual titillation that these conversations offered, they were just comforting. It was a cure to loneliness. I wonder if there was just something at that moment that coincided between increase in solitude and a thirst for these contrarian conversations. I guess contrarian is also
and
bad word.
not alone, and also not crazy.
Right,
That's
right.
a big part of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
You could find a voice that isn't Rush Limbaugh, right? To talk to you about those things.
Yeah, or also right, because a lot of it is sort of like, wow, am I crazy? Like, why are all my friends, like my female friends, who we all grew up pretty much the same way, and we used to make the same kind of jokes and talk about the same kind of things. How come all of a sudden they feel that they're living in a world that hates women? Why all of a sudden are they talking about feeling unsafe all the time? Am I nuts? And so it was really nice to find, that I wasn't. Let's just put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So without, obviously I don't want to put you in a spot, and if you don't want to answer, just also feel free and we can cut it out. We are now like 5, 6 years, 7 years, whatever after that. And it feels like a lot of the voices that were of comfort and sense back then have kind of, as we spoke, like closed ranks around certain ideologies and have become more inflexible, less open to actually having the sort of branded, nuanced conversations of the 2014, 2015s. First of all, did you feel that? And if so, how does that affect you on the parasocial level?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I just did an interview with David Fuller from Rebel Wisdom, and he's been writing a lot about the IDW, and he's been highly critical of people like Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying on the ivermectin stuff, and he's very rigorous about it, but I think he's burned at least a few bridges. We talked a lot about how this has to do with audience capture. It really does. I mean, it's great to be an independent journalist or have your own media platform and not rely on sponsors. But the problem with, having your livelihood come directly from your audience is that then you have to keep giving your audience what they want. So I think that I keep saying I feel like we're going to have a kind of heterodox 2.0 start to come up. People who maybe don't have such big audiences were less captured. I mean, that's one nice thing. Like I have a nice audience, and it's growing steadily, but it is not stratospheric. I'm not Barry Weiss by any stretch. I'm not blocked and reported by any stretch. I'm not, and I'm not saying that either of those examples are really what you're referring to, but I think that there's something nice about having a kind of quiet ecosystem, at least in the beginning. And I do think that there is an audience out there for less didactic takes. Most of my listeners say, we appreciate what you're doing. We appreciate that you're not throwing out the red meat. We appreciate that you're bringing on the guest that we haven't heard of, rather than the usual person who's going to come on and talk about, gender, for instance. So I am hopeful in that regard.
And what about the emotional level? Did you feel something? Do you still feel something is missing? Because I remember, I think leading up to the 2020 elections and maybe even after that, from my own perspective, the feeling of loneliness was absolutely oppressive and overwhelming on the parasocial level. I couldn't find a reliable compass. I couldn't find somebody that I could reliably turn to as, okay, I'm not alone, I'm not insane.
Wait, so are you saying that at that time there wasn't even like a podcast or YouTuber that you could go to for solace? Is that what you're saying? I'm trying to just
Yeah.
understand.
Sorry, yes.
Oh wow, no, because that's God. I mean, that's so interesting because maybe there's not like one. I don't think I ever had like one person that I followed. I mean, I think if anything, John McWhorter, the way he talked about race gave me permission to talk about women in a certain way. So, and I still, I think, I said when I talked to Mike Pesca, like, John McWhorter is like the person everybody kind of trots out. It's like, he's like the Marshall McLuhan of this sphere of influence. It's like, well, I happen to have John McWhorter right here. And he said, you know nothing of what you speak. This is a reference to Woody Allen movie in case anybody doesn't know.
Annie Hall.
So that's right. So I think I pretty, Sam Harris for the most part and John McWhorter, I think they're pretty solid with some blind spots. But yeah, I don't know.
Okay, so I don't know if we have a hard out for this interview, but I do want to make sure that I ask you about humor. So I have this really less than half-baked sense that our society is hemorrhaging its sense of humor and irony and levity. And as a result, everything is being absorbed with excess severity, more than the subjects deserve. And I don't know if that's a legitimate concern, or is it just me having been raised by Gen Xers, so I deal with my problems by throwing irony at them?
Oh, I mean, there is still, I mean, irony. Again, I hate to be so like essentialist with talking about these generations because, oh God, sorry, this dogs. You can just leave that. This is yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think that I mean, I don't know. Like South Park is still like the best thing going. If you want to feel not insane, you should just watch South Park.
No, right, but that's
still
like,
on.
but that's a relic, right?
I know. No, it's still on. They're still making them.
Yeah, but it's
right.
a relic in terms of it's
no, exactly.
a relic of a different time of telling stories and making jokes. Like even Jon Stewart to some extent is that. It was redolent of a different cultural sensibility. But you can see the difference in late night shows and comedies and the tone of public social conversations. Irony, which requires some self-debasement, is disappearing. And instead we have a push for self-seriousness and gravitas and anger and panic and hysteria.
Yeah, well, and it's literal. Yeah, okay, I know.
Yes.
I know what you're asking. Okay, yeah, these comedians, there used to be an assumption that everybody was operating with a certain level of irony, literacy, right? So, and I don't, for some reason, that has fallen away. I think maybe sometimes people irony is interpreted as like a form of harm, or somehow it's like not inclusive because maybe some people don't get it. I mean, there used to just be an acceptance that a lot of people weren't going to get your joke. Like that was part of being a creative person. Not everybody was going to get what you're saying. Your audience is your audience. It's not the whole world. So yeah, I mean, people are still really funny in the back channels. Let's just put it that way. That's the thing.
That's interesting. I don't find that actually. I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm just thinking about like relationships at work or whatever, and just like
that's not a back channel. That's not a back channel. I mean, I had so when Mike Pesca was on the show, I asked him what it was like to work at NPR back in the day, and then in the 90s and the early aughts when he worked there. And, he called it an esprit de corps. Like there was a sense in the office, like, that you would joke around and everybody kind of was on the same page. And, there was a joviality to the office. And, I if I ever was going to write a cultured piece again, maybe I would write about this. Like the whole genre of the office sitcom, the workplace based sitcom, that is premised on people like, playing practical jokes on each other and making fun of each other, and somebody being a fool and somebody being the straight
somebody falling in love with somebody else.
Yeah, and like that whole that way of being in the workplace is no longer acceptable. And there used to be an incredible joy in being working around like-minded adults. Let's just put it that way. I mean, I remember the first time I worked in a real office with adults. And I was like, this is fantastic. I thought these people, and everyone would just joke.
Yeah.
It was at the Film Society of Lincoln Center. I was an intern during college, and everyone would there was just this big office, and everyone would just sit around and talk about films, but also just like say anything. And, everybody, it was very sophisticated, but nobody took themselves too seriously. And it was great. But that's not available anymore. So I think you're right about that. When I say the back channels, I literally mean like, when people get together for drinks or like text threads where they say the worst things. I mean, like there's plenty of at least Gen Xers. I will tell you that the Gen Xers are plenty funny
Are meeting for dark
when you're
dark
not listening.
Drinks,
Yes,
hilarious
when you're not
discussions.
listening, it's still pretty good.
I love it. It's
Gen Xers, if you're out there, invite us to your bars.
funny and afraid. Funny and afraid.
We're not good
right.
enough. We know that we're not good enough at technology to know that we might be getting plugged and distributed. So, yeah.
I am trying to think where, if at all, those back channels exist for our generation, because I definitely not in any work environment that I had. That goes without saying, especially like when you work at CNN or something that shocked me in working in journalism in the US, because I think I kind of had the fantasy that you were describing in terms of what I would come into, which would be such this vibrant community of curious people who are funny and irreverent.
Yeah.
Instead, I found a lot of people who are politically dour and who talk about SNL. And the only people that I found that had the spirit of joyful and slightly self-effacing argument were the conservatives in the office. Some of them closeted conservatives.
The conservatives have become more fun, haven't they? They're the fun ones. Can you believe that? That's like having been a teenager in the 80s. The conservatives were the absolute stick in the mud, church lady, religious zealots, banning all art, no humor allowed. And it's like reversed now.
I got to say, that's why when conservatives start pushing their anti-CRT laws or their sexual puritanism laws in Florida, I'm like, oh, whew, what a relief. The world is back on its axis.
I know, they're back to their old selves. Like this, I understand.
Order is restored.
Right? Yes.
Yeah,
Right.
this I understand.
Right.
Conservatism is old puritanical scolds. I don't understand conservatism as an edgy subculture. That's too weird for me. Conservative,
Right.
it's by definition, it shouldn't be an edgy subculture.
Right.
But yeah, I just find the general lack of humor in the public discourse to be disappointing. Lack of joy in disagreement. Lack of the joy of battle.
Yeah.
I guess that goes to the sense of threat, that every interaction feels like it's a real threat. Makes it like, how can you joke about this? It's literally a life and death situation. It's not. But even if we are losing the battle on one front or another, this is all the more excuse to have fun and joke about it. My favorite humor is Holocaust humor. So come on, like just
that was that old Sarah Silverman joke. Was it what did Jews hate most about the Holocaust? The cost.
Oh gosh.
Remember that? That was that. She made that joke. She made that joke.
I wonder if she would make it today though.
No. She has said she has like denounced a lot of her old jokes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So,
Yeah.
sorry. I shouldn't have
Shall
made
we-
that joke as a non-Jew.
No,
I'm sorry. You can take that out.
Adam's always in favor of Holocaust jokes.
Yeah, I'm the John
more, the
McWhorter
better.
of Holocaust jokes. I give you permission. I
Now
extend
that-
permission.
them.
Is a brand. I've ever heard one.
All right, Meghan, our question that we like to ask as many guests as we can remember to ask them. What do you see as the biggest blind spots on the left and the biggest blind spots on the right?
Oh God, I thought you were going to ask me about my personal blind spots.
Oh,
which
well,
are
you
many.
can add that on if you'd like.
Surely you have none.
Oh gosh, I mean blind spot on the left. Well, you know what? Let me just say, I don't know. My own blind spot is that I have a sort of unusual sensibility. Like, when I would say like, oh, women are, we've never been doing better. I don't know what you're talking about. You feel like you're oppressed by the patriarchy. It's nonsense. That's because I have a particular kind of experience. And I'm kind of an outlier. Like, I was never a girly girl. I'm still not, but I'm a heterosexual woman. I mean, but I don't have kids, for instance. I never wanted kids. That gives me a huge economic advantage. That gives me a huge professional advantage. There's a whole bunch of problems that I don't have to deal with because of that, for instance. So I'm really an outlier in a lot of ways when it comes to the female experience. I mean, I don't know, the blind spots of the left versus the right. I think it's really just toward each other. A huge percentage of people on the right think that like most people on the left are in unions, for instance. Like there's a massive misconception, and a lot of people on the left think that an enormous amount of people on the right are like evangelical Christians, and neither of those things are true. So I just think there's just stereotypes that have become sort of operating principles.
Though we on a podcast that I was editing, I think it was The Remnant. I was editing the other day and talking about the question of, I think it was regarding Obama's foreign policy, that he had the tendency of kind of trying to tell anybody who was negotiating with like what's good for them, rather than trying to understand what's good for them. Like, I understand your interests better, trust me, and you should just do as I say. I think it was with Shadi Hamid, and Shadi Hamid said, yeah, and that's generally a problem for the left, right? That the left tends to do that. And Jonah Goldberg, who was hosting the podcast, responded saying that, yeah, it's something that I'd say that maybe both sides sometimes do. But I think that the difference is that the right, because it culturally it's been like a cultural minority, a beleaguered minority, had to fit into the liberal mainstream a little bit. And as a result, they do a better job at actually approximating what a liberal thinks than a liberal does at understanding what a conservative thinks. I thought that was an interesting thought. Don't know if I agree with it or not, but it's definitely true that being a cultural minority forces you to an extent to assimilate with the majority perception.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the campus conservatives talk about, just keeping their mouths shut, right? A lot. And you'd see it. They do.
And they have to learn how to navigate.
Great. Actually, let's spend the remaining 3 minutes on this point. Self-censorship. Because that you just alluded to I assume the article that was just published. And it was an interesting question. It was a question that I despicably forgot to bring up with Jacob Mishangama. And what do you think about that? It's a very difficult subject to kind of grapple with, the idea of self-censorship, because on the one hand, it really undermines the dream of having a free liberal society if there are some topics that we feel cannot be brought up. On the other hand, there will always be topics that are either taboo or that people are just not interested in hearing, like my experience at CNN. Like I mentioned, like I tried to bring in a topic. It's not like I was canceled. It's not like I was shut down, but just people were not interested in having those conversations. So like I self-censored in the sense that I realized that I don't have a partner for this discussion. But is that really something worth the moral outrage that it seems to be getting? And maybe it is. Like I'm actually grappling with it. So
are you talking about Sarah Hepela's piece in The Atlantic?
That one too.
I am going to be interviewing Sarah in an hour. So
nice.
For the podcast, as it happens. Well, I know Sarah, and this is something that she and I have talked about for years in the back channels. Uh, I know what she's saying. I'm gonna know more about what she's thinking after my conversation with her. But I mean, just like, more broadly, self-censorship is a spectrum, right? Like there's self-censorship in the extreme, which is that I'm afraid to open my mouth and say anything. Um, and there's like, little bits of it where, I know like what you're saying, like I know there's no point. I'm not gonna die on this hill, or there's no point in bringing this up, or there's not, I don't, the people I'm with aren't interested in this topic. I mean, is it self-censorship if like I go to a party and people don't want to talk about um what's about gender ideology? Like it's like, I mean, I don't, that's not self-censorship. That's
Right.
just like,
Common
not,
sense.
trying to be socially, normal. so I mean, it's just, the thing is everything's kind of a spectrum, right? So, and I guess censorship is, I would have to think about that. I think censorship is kind of a spectrum. Free speech is a spectrum. I mean, so yeah, but I do think I can tell you that there are a lot of journalists and writers that we say, I really wish I could write about this, but it's not worth it. I'm not going to do it. And that's what Sarah's piece was about.
Right. There's also from a month ago, right? There's what's her name on the New York Times? Emma Kemp.
That was already a month ago. Gosh, yeah, the UVA
Was it a
student.
month ago, or
yeah.
is it this month? I'm totally lost. What month is this? Is this April? Is this
Well,
March?
I don't
idea
know
what's going
when
on.
you're gonna post this, but yeah.
But yes, I wonder just psychologically. I mean, of course, there was a problem there in terms of how it trickles down. But how do we deal with this? Is the solution just to keep talking about this and kind of expressing our moral discomfort with the fact that people are self-censoring? Usually, I'm from the position of most of our problems in the U.S. right now are cultural problems, in the sense that it's not something that can be cured by policy. It's not something that can be cured by any like mandated behavior. It's something that requires a mind shift.
Yeah.
Free speech is, as far as I'm concerned, 100% that. Like all the laws in the world can protect free speech when you're culturally resistant to it.
Right.
When you're ostracizing people for speech crimes.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I don't know what that means in terms of our responsibility around this topic.
Well, I mean, it depends on what the stakes are. I mean, I've been guilty of saying to people like, why don't you just, man up and woman up, whatever, and like say your piece. Why do you have to be such a coward? But, again, I have a blind spot in that I don't like have a job, like if somebody gets mad at me, nobody's going to fire me. I don't have a family that I'm dragging down with me. I can afford, I don't want to lose my livelihood, but like if I was out on the street, it would just be me out on the street. You know what I'm saying? And my enormous dog. But I think that, this is what I try to do on the podcast. Like when I talk about like the heterodoxy 2.0, I want to get to a place where instead of talking about the fact that we can't talk about things, we just go ahead and talk about them. But that means talking about them in the right way, and like really the right way, like not the way that's going to get a lot of clicks, not in the way that's going to, appease your audience and like, just make more of the echo chamber, echo. It's to really, really have the conversations that need to happen with the right people. And so, I often say, often it's like if you're a smart person, you're smart enough to know to keep your mouth shut, right? But if the smart, thoughtful people don't speak up, the stupid, thoughtless people are happy to do the job, and that's what we have. I think
and monetize it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I think what we need is just to refine the conversations now. Say, okay, we're not going to be afraid to talk about these things, but the way to make them, the way to make those conversations havable is to show how they can be had respectfully and accurately. And I can't say unassailably, because nothing's ever going to be unassailable, but have that conversation in a way that nobody can come after you and tell you that you're, that you're a horrible bigot. Nobody has come to me and said the way that you're talking about gender ideology is transphobic. Anybody who says that to me is acting clearly in bad faith.
And you're making it public, as clear as possible to any third-party observer that this criticism is in bad faith, because I have done everything to cover my ass.
Well, I mean, I don't see it. Frankly,
You're not even getting that, right?
I don't see it. I'm sure it's there. I'm sure people don't appreciate it. But the fact is, I am doing this with such excruciating care that I really don't think, I know nobody has any grounds for telling me that I am causing harm to anybody by having these conversations. If anything, I have heard that they are incredibly productive and have illuminated, have been of great illumination and, helped many, many people who don't have the whole story. So anyway,
and if anybody claims harm, they can go fuck themselves.
I don't care. The thing is, like, there's nothing anybody could say to me that would make me, I mean, certainly, like, I would consider some, criticism, but it's just simply not true. So I think that obviously, like, this is a subject I think a lot about and I know a lot about at this point. So, I'm not saying I'm going to get everything right, obviously, but I just think that if we, say to yourself, I want to talk about X, instead of bringing on obvious person to talk about X who has a best-selling book about it, or, I know I'm going to get 1 million listens if I have this person on, I'm going to bring in this other person who's actually better on this subject and that will further the conversation. And I think that's what we have to start doing in this space, this intellectual space. That's another horrible word, isn't it? This space.
Oh my God, intellectual space. I have monologues about how much I hate the word space.
Yeah.
I'm giving you finger snaps or jazz hands or whatever is the least triggering. Thank you so much, Meghan. This is awesome.
Meghan.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. We are Uncertain Pod on the social media, and our DMs are always open. If you feel like supporting us, share us with your friends and enemies. And until next time, stay sane.